The subway shooting was over, but now the law had to decide what fear is allowed to justify. The subway vigilante. When fear pulled the trigger. By the time the case reached the courtroom, the city had already formed its opinions. The shooting was no longer just an event. It had become a symbol shaped by fear, headlines, and public debate. Now, the law faced a question it could not avoid. How do you measure fear when it becomes a defense? The investigation did not begin in silence. It began under noise. Before detectives finished reconstructing the scene, before reports were typed and evidence logged, the city was already speaking. Newspapers had opinions, radio hosts had conclusions, television panels had narratives ready to fill airtime. The police were not immune to this. They worked inside the same city, rode the same subways, heard the same stories, felt the same tension that had been building for years beneath the streets. Officially, the investigation followed procedure. Witnesses were interviewed, ballistics were analyzed, timelines were drawn. The subway car was measured and photographed until it became a technical diagram, rather than a place where people had stood moments before everything changed. Unofficially, pressure was everywhere. There was pressure to move carefully, pressure not to rush, pressure not to inflame an already divided city. Bernhard Goetz was not treated like a typical suspect. From the beginning, language softened, statements emphasized fear, context, his previous assault, his state of mind. Police spoke publicly about understanding the environment he had been in. This did not mean the investigation was dishonest. It meant it was human. Fear has a way of entering systems through people. Detectives understood the subway. They understood the unpredictability. Many had spent years responding to violence underground. The idea that someone might believe they had no other option did not feel foreign. Still, facts resisted simplicity. 4 teenagers had been shot, 1 was permanently paralyzed, and 1 shot stood apart from the others. Darrell Cabey had been on the ground when Goetz fired again. That moment refused to fit neatly into the story forming around the case. Investigators returned to it repeatedly. They asked where Cabey was positioned, whether he could move, whether he posed an immediate threat, whether fear could reasonably justify that final decision. A screwdriver found on one of the teenagers entered the conversation. For some, it became proof. For others, a distraction. The screwdriver did not answer the central question, it only amplified it. How much certainty is required before violence becomes acceptable? Inside the district attorney's office, the case was weighed carefully. Prosecutors understood the stakes. They were not just deciding whether to bring charges, they were deciding how the city would interpret its own fear. Charging Goetz aggressively risked backlash. Appearing lenient risked something else entirely. Justice does not operate in isolation. It operates in public. Grand juries were convened, evidence presented, witnesses called. But outside those rooms, opinions were already set. The legal process moved slower than emotion, slower than headlines, slower than belief. Police statements were parsed word by word. Every hesitation noticed, every emphasis dissected. Neutrality was interpreted as bias, caution as endorsement. The investigation did not collapse under pressure, but it bent, subtly, incrementally, in ways that are difficult to measure and impossible to fully undo. The case against Bernhard Goetz was no longer just about what had happened in a subway car. It was about whether the legal system could separate fear from justification, or whether it would absorb the city's anxiety and call it reason. By the time prosecutors prepared to present the case to a grand jury, one thing was clear. This would not be a simple question of guilt or innocence. It would be a test of law, of restraint, of how much fear justice could carry without breaking. The law would now decide if fear was reasonable. The decision came quietly. There was no courtroom drama, no verdict read aloud to a packed room, no moment designed for television, just a legal determination made behind closed doors, delivered in measured language that carried consequences far beyond its words. The grand jury declined to indict Bernhard Goetz on attempted murder charges. For many people, the sentence did not land immediately. It had to be explained, translated, interpreted. What did it mean to shoot 4 people and not be charged with trying to kill them? The answer rested on a concept that sounded simple until it was applied: reasonable fear. In the grand jury room, prosecutors presented evidence, witness statements, ballistics, the sequence of shots, the position of bodies. The final shot, again and again, returned to the center of discussion. But the law did not ask whether fear was accurate. It asked whether it could be understood. Jurors were instructed to consider what a person in Goetz's position might reasonably believe, not with hindsight, not with perfect information, but in the moment, underground, confined, surrounded by strangers. The subway itself became part of the argument, its history, its reputation, its atmosphere. Fear was no longer treated as a reaction, it was treated as context. When the decision became public, the city reacted as if a verdict had already been delivered. Supporters felt vindicated. Critics felt dismissed. Both sides read confirmation into the same words. For some, the grand jury's choice affirmed something they had long believed, that the system finally understood what it meant to feel unsafe, that the law was capable of recognizing fear as legitimate. For others, the decision felt like erasure, a suggestion that the harm done, especially to Darrell Cabey, could be folded into a broader narrative about anxiety and survival. The absence of an indictment did not settle the case, it sharpened it. The phrase reasonable fear began to circulate beyond the courtroom. It appeared in editorials, in radio debates, in conversations that drifted from crime into something more personal. Whose fear is reasonable? And who decides? The grand jury had not said Goetz was innocent. It had not said he was justified. It had said the case did not meet the threshold required for the charges sought. But thresholds are not moral statements, they are legal ones. And legal language has a way of feeling definitive even when it is not. The city responded accordingly. Some people spoke as if the question had been answered, as if the shooting had been resolved not just legally, but ethically. Others felt the ground shift beneath them, a sense that something important had been decided without their consent. Protests followed. So did counter-protests. Voices grew louder, positions hardened. Fear, once again, moved faster than nuance. The grand jury's decision did something subtle and irreversible. It changed the center of gravity, from whether the shooting was justified to whether fear itself could be challenged. Because if fear was reasonable, then action followed naturally. And if action followed naturally, then consequence became negotiable. The legal process would continue. There would be more hearings, more arguments, more chances to examine what happened. But something had already been set in motion, a precedent, not in law, but in belief. The idea that fear, once accepted, could do more than explain violence. It could excuse it. The trial did not begin with clarity. It began with distance. Months had passed since the subway shooting. Enough time for the city to argue itself into exhaustion. Enough time for the original images to soften at the edges, replaced by opinions that felt sturdier than memory. Inside the courtroom, the law tried to slow everything down. Here, seconds were stretched into diagrams. Movements were broken into angles. Words spoken under stress were replayed until they lost their original tone and took on new meaning. The subway car was rebuilt on paper, a controlled space where fear could be examined without experiencing it. Bernhard Goetz sat quietly at the defense table. He did not look like a man on trial for violence. He looked like someone waiting for a bus, ordinary, restrained, a person whose presence did not demand attention. That mattered. The defense did not deny the shooting. It did not need to. The facts were not in dispute. What mattered was interpretation. They returned again and again to Goetz's state of mind, to his past assault, to the reputation of the subway, to the idea that fear, once triggered, does not unfold in neat stages. Fear, they argued, collapses time. It does not wait for confirmation. It does not measure proportionality. It acts. Prosecutors focused on a single moment, the final shot, Darrell Cabey on the floor, unable to move, no longer advancing. They asked the jury to consider whether fear could still justify action at that point, whether self-defense had an endpoint, whether the law was meant to protect reactions or limits. The question hung in the room without resolution. Witnesses described chaos, inconsistent memories, confusion. Each account overlapped with the next, not perfectly, but enough to suggest how unreliable perception becomes under stress. Experts spoke about trauma, about how past violence reshapes threat recognition, about how the body responds before the mind can intervene. Nothing contradicted anything else directly. Everything existed in tension. The courtroom was not deciding what had happened. It was deciding when it stopped being acceptable. Jurors were asked to imagine themselves in Goetz's position, underground, surrounded, without time to think, to place their own fear into his moment. At the same time, they were asked to step back, to apply restraint, to decide where self-defense ends and excess begins. Those two tasks did not fit together easily. The law demanded a line. Fear refused to draw one. Throughout the trial, the city watched closely. Every development was reported, interpreted, and argued over again outside the courtroom. The legal process became another stage in the same unresolved debate. By the time closing arguments were delivered, one thing was clear. This trial would not deliver consensus, it would deliver a ruling, and those two things are not the same. The verdict arrived without ceremony, no gasp, no collective release of breath, just words, read carefully, carrying weight unevenly. Bernhard Goetz was acquitted of attempted murder, acquitted of assault. He was convicted only of illegal possession of a firearm. The distinction mattered, and yet it didn't land the same way for everyone. Legally, the decision was precise. The jury had followed the instructions. They had applied the law as it was written, not as many people wished it to be. They had separated fear from intent, reaction from planning. In the language of the court, the outcome made sense. In the language of the city, it did not. The verdict did not say that what happened was right. It did not say that it was wrong. It said something narrower, that the state had not proven, beyond a reasonable doubt, that Bernhard Goetz intended to commit murder. That distinction sat uncomfortably with the images people could not forget. 4 teenagers shot in a subway car, one left permanently paralyzed, a final shot that lingered in memory longer than any legal explanation. Outside the courthouse, reactions split instantly. Supporters spoke of relief, of vindication, of a system that finally understood the reality of fear. They said the jury had recognized what ordinary people already knew, that danger does not wait politely, and neither can those who face it. Critics spoke of failure, of a system that had drawn its boundaries too generously, of a verdict that felt less like restraint and more like permission. Both groups believed the law had spoken. They disagreed on what it had said. Goetz was sentenced to time for carrying an illegal gun, months, not years, a punishment that acknowledged wrongdoing without touching the central act itself. The message was subtle. You cannot carry a weapon illegally, but what you do with it under fear may be understood. That message did not come from a speech. It came from absence, from the charges that were not sustained, from the convictions that were not made. In legal terms, the case was resolved. In moral terms, it remained open. The verdict created a separation that would echo long after the courtroom emptied. Legal truth, defined by thresholds, standards, and procedure. Moral truth, shaped by empathy, experience, and belief. The law had answered one question. The city was still asking another. What does justice look like when fear is part of the equation? For Darrell Cabey, the answer was immediate and permanent. He would live with the physical consequences regardless of how the verdict was interpreted. His life did not reset when the jury spoke. For Bernhard Goetz, the verdict marked an ending and a beginning. He was no longer only a suspect. He was a man legally cleared of the most serious charges and permanently defined by the case that made him known. The courtroom closed. The city stepped outside, and the gap between what the law decided and what people felt remained unresolved, waiting for the next moment when fear would test the boundaries again. Darrell Cabey did not become a symbol by choice. Before the shooting, he was a teenager moving through the city like thousands of others. A young life still forming, still unfinished, still ordinary in ways that rarely survive headlines. Whatever plans he had that day, they did not include becoming the quiet center of a national argument. After the shooting, he could not move his legs. The bullet had damaged his spinal cord. The injury was permanent, the kind of permanence that does not announce itself loudly, but settles in slowly, day by day, as the body fails to respond to commands it once followed without thought. While the city debated fear, Cabey learned a new reality. Hospitals replaced subway stations. Medical terminology replaced casual conversation. Independence became something to negotiate rather than assume. The future narrowed, not in imagination, but in logistics. This was not a legal question, it was physical. Cabey did not participate in talk shows. He did not appear regularly in the media. His story did not lend itself easily to framing. It did not offer clarity or closure. It only offered consequence. In the courtroom, his presence was reduced to evidence. Medical reports, testimony, diagrams of injury. The language of law translated his body into categories and thresholds. Outside the courtroom, his life continued, altered in ways no verdict could correct. When Cabey filed a civil lawsuit against Bernhard Goetz, it was not about rewriting the criminal case. It was about acknowledgement, about assigning responsibility where criminal law had stopped. The court ruled in Cabey's favor. Millions of dollars were awarded in damages. The numbers sounded large, definitive, compensatory. It was also symbolic. No amount of money could restore mobility. No judgment could return what had been taken in seconds underground. The ruling recognized harm, but recognition is not restoration. Cabey would never walk again. This fact existed independently of debates about fear, self-defense, or reasonable belief. It did not care how the case was framed. It did not adjust itself to public opinion. It simply remained. In the broader story, Cabey's injury often became a footnote, mentioned briefly, explained clinically, then moved past in favor of larger questions. But consequences do not disappear because attention shifts. They wait. They live in bodies, not arguments. The Goetz case was discussed as a turning point, a cultural moment, a legal test. For Darrell Cabey, it was the dividing line between before and after, a point from which everything else had to be rebuilt, slowly, unevenly, without guarantees. When people spoke about fear, they rarely spoke about his. When they debated safety, they did not debate his. His life did not fit neatly into narratives about vigilance or justice. It complicated them, and complications are often set aside. The cost of the shooting was not abstract. It was human, permanent, unavoidable. And it existed long after the subway doors closed, long after cameras moved on, long after the city found new arguments to occupy its attention. Some consequences do not echo loudly. They endure quietly. The case ended on paper. The files were closed. Sentences were served. Appeals faded from headlines. In legal terms, the system had done what it was designed to do, reach a conclusion and move on. But the story did not move on with it. Bernhard Goetz did not disappear after the verdict. He remained present, visible in ways that felt unusual for someone at the center of such a case. He gave interviews, spoke publicly, at times seemed almost compelled to explain himself again and again. For some, his visibility felt like confidence. For others, provocation. Goetz became something more durable than a defendant. He became a reference point, a name used to shortcut longer conversations about crime, fear, and self-defense. When people argued about whether citizens should be allowed to protect themselves, his name surfaced. When discussions turned to subway safety, he reappeared. When debates about gun laws intensified, he was mentioned again. He was no longer just Bernhard Goetz. He was the subway vigilante. That label followed him more closely than any legal outcome ever could. Attempts to step away from the case failed. Even years later, interviews circled back to the same questions. Was he sorry? Would he do it again? Did he believe the jury got it right? Each answer was heard differently depending on who was listening. To supporters, Goetz remained a man who had been forced to act, someone who had done what others were afraid to admit they might do themselves. His continued presence felt like defiance or honesty. To critics, it felt like something else, a refusal to recognize harm, a comfort with attention built on suffering that was not his alone. The public never reached agreement. That disagreement hardened into something quieter, but more permanent. The case became shorthand, a way to invoke fear without explaining it, a way to justify positions without revisiting details. Over time, the specifics blurred, dates faded, names were forgotten, but the idea remained intact. Fear can justify action, and action can be forgiven. Goetz's later life unfolded under that shadow. Attempts at normalcy were interrupted by reminders of who he had become to the public. Political ambitions surfaced briefly, then receded. Public appearances drew attention, not because of what he said, but because of what he represented. He did not control the symbol he had become. No one ever does. Meanwhile, the city changed. Crime rates dropped. The subway was cleaned, rebranded, made safer. New generations rode the same lines without carrying the same expectations of danger. But the memory lingered, not as a clear lesson, but as a cautionary shape. The Goetz case did not resolve the question of self-defense. It did not settle debates about fear or justice. It simply added weight to them, a reminder that once a line is crossed, it does not easily return to where it was. The aftermath was not loud, it was persistent. A man, a moment, a story that refused to stay in the past. The Goetz case did not change the law overnight. There was no single statute rewritten because of it, no immediate reform announced in response to public outrage or support. On paper, the legal system remained mostly the same. In practice, something had shifted. The case entered classrooms, law reviews, panel discussions. It became a reference point, not for what it proved, but for what it exposed. A living example of how fear operates when it is invited into legal reasoning. Self-defense had always existed in the law, but the Goetz case expanded the conversation around it, not formally, culturally. It raised a question that refused to stay contained. If fear is reasonable, what follows from it? The idea of vigilante justice was no longer theoretical. It had a face, a date, a location, a set of consequences that could not be abstracted away. People debated whether the case represented a necessary acknowledgement of reality or a dangerous erosion of restraint. Neither side could fully dismiss the other. Supporters pointed to the conditions of the city at the time, the lack of trust, the sense of abandonment. They argued that the law had finally recognized what people experienced daily, that waiting for help was not always an option. Critics warned of precedent, of how easily fear could be stretched, of how quickly perception could replace proof. They argued that legitimizing fear-based violence risked empowering those most willing to act on their worst assumptions. Both arguments carried weight, and both traced their logic back to the same subway car. Years later, as debates over stand-your-ground laws emerged across the country, the Goetz case resurfaced, not as a legal blueprint, but as a cautionary memory, a reminder of what happens when self-defense is interpreted expansively, without clear limits. The case did not answer the question of where the line should be. It demonstrated how fragile that line can be. Legacy is not always about change. Sometimes it is about exposure. The Goetz case exposed how quickly fear can move from private feeling to public justification, how media framing can accelerate that movement, and how the law, designed to be objective, must still operate within a society shaped by emotion. The legacy was not consensus, it was unease. In the end, there is no final image, no definitive conclusion, no statement that resolves the tension. The subway doors close, the train moves forward, the city continues. What remains is not the sound of gunfire, but the space it left behind. A silence filled with unanswered questions that resist neat answers. Was this self-defense? Or was it a line society chose to move? At what point does fear stop protecting and start deciding who is allowed to be harmed? And when fear's treated as reasonable, whose fear counts? The law gave one answer. The city gave many. None of them erased the consequences. Next on True Echoes. Next episode, we follow a long-haul truck driver who left more than victims behind. As letters signed with a smiling face begin arriving at newsrooms, investigators realize they are not just chasing a killer, they are chasing someone who wants to be seen. The truth coming soon on True Echoes. Stories like this endure not because they are shocking, but because they are uncomfortable. They force us to confront how easily we accept violence when it aligns with our own anxieties. They ask us to look not at the person who pulled the trigger, but at the environment that made that trigger feel reachable. The Bernhard Goetz case does not tell us what to think. It asks us to notice where we already stand and to consider quietly what we are willing to accept in the name of feeling safe. Every voice matters. Subscribe and step into the echoes of truth. To be continued.